The silk of Eleanor Thompson's wedding dress felt like a shroud against her skin as she stood alone in the cramped back room of Pendleton's only church, listening to the murmurs of confusion rippling through the congregation like wind through wheat fields. Through the thin wooden walls, she could hear Reverend Morrison clearing his throat for the third time, his discomfort palpable, even from where she stood frozen, her bouquet of wild roses trembling in her white-knuckled grip. It was June of 1882, and the Oregon sun blazed mercilessly through the single window, making the small space feel like an oven, but the cold spreading through Eleanor's chest had nothing to do with temperature. "Miss Thompson, I think we should perhaps—" Mrs. Patterson, the Reverend's wife, trailed off, her plump hands twisting in her apron as she stood in the doorway, her eyes filled with the kind of pity that made Eleanor want to scream. "He's coming," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Charles is just running late. The ranch is far, and something must have delayed him." But even as she spoke the words, she knew they tasted like lies. Charles Whitmore had been staying in town at the hotel for the past 3 days specifically to prepare for this moment. There was no ranch emergency, no broken wagon wheel, no injured horse that could explain his absence. The church had been full for nearly an hour now, and the whispers had grown from concerned to scandalous. Mrs. Patterson's expression crumpled further, and she stepped aside as heavy boots echoed on the wooden floorboards outside. Eleanor's heart leaped with desperate hope, but it wasn't Charles who appeared in the doorway. Instead, James Whitmore, Charles's younger brother, stood there with his hat in his hands and an expression that told Eleanor everything she needed to know before he opened his mouth. "Eleanor, James couldn't meet her eyes. At 19, he was 4 years younger than both Eleanor and Charles, still gangly and uncomfortable in his Sunday suit. "Charles asked me to tell you that he can't go through with it. He's gone." The words should have hurt more than they did. Perhaps Eleanor had known, deep in some part of herself, that she'd refused to acknowledge, that something had shifted in Charles over the past few months. The way his eyes had started to wander when they walked through town together. The increasing frequency of his excuses to cut their visits short. The distance that had grown between them even as their wedding day approached. "Gone where?" Eleanor heard herself ask, her voice sounding strange and distant to her own ears. James's face flushed red, and he looked at his boots. "He left early this morning, took the stage to Portland with—" He swallowed hard. "With Lily Morrison, the Reverend's daughter, a girl who had just turned 18 last month, with golden curls and dimples and the kind of fresh-faced beauty that made men stupid." Eleanor had seen Charles talking to her after church services, had noticed the way Lily giggled and blushed, but she dismissed it as harmless flirtation. Charles had been her intended for 2 years. They'd made plans, talked about building a house on the property adjacent to his family's ranch, discussed how many children they'd have. "I see," Eleanor said quietly, and she was surprised to find that she did see, with a clarity that was almost painful. Charles was 23, same as her, but he'd never quite grown out of his boyish need for novelty and excitement. Eleanor was steady, practical, a woman who knew how to run a household and keep accounts and make difficult decisions. Those were qualities people praised, but they weren't the qualities that made men write poetry or act foolishly. Lily was all giggles and curls and youth, and apparently that had been enough to make Charles forget every promise he'd ever made. "Eleanor, I'm so sorry. Charles is a fool and a coward, and if I could change this, I would." James's voice cracked with genuine distress, and Eleanor felt a flash of sympathy for him. None of this was his fault. "Thank you for telling me," she said, setting down her bouquet with careful precision. "Would you please ask everyone to leave? I need a moment." James nodded and fled, clearly grateful to escape. Eleanor heard his voice outside, heard the collective gasp and then the eruption of shocked conversation. She heard Mrs. Patterson's voice rising above the others, shrill with indignation. She heard boots and shoes scuffing on wood as the congregation slowly filed out, their voices carrying back to her with words like shameful and disgrace and that poor girl. Eleanor stood very still in the center of the small room, surrounded by the trappings of a wedding that would never happen. She'd spent weeks sewing this dress, had carefully embroidered tiny flowers along the hem and sleeves. She'd pressed wildflowers to decorate the church pews. She'd written out a menu for the reception dinner at the hotel, had spent her savings on new linens and kitchen supplies for the home she'd thought she'd be making with Charles. She was 23 years old, which wasn't exactly old, but it was old enough that people had started to whisper about spinsterhood before Charles had proposed. Her parents had died 3 years ago in a wagon accident, leaving her with a small inheritance and the tiny house on the edge of Pendleton where she took in sewing and mending to supplement her modest income. She had no siblings, no close family, except for a cousin in California she'd never met. Charles's proposal had seemed like the answer to everything, a promise of security and companionship, and a future that made sense. Now, she had nothing but a wedding dress she'd never wear and a town full of people who would forever remember her as the woman abandoned at the altar for a younger, prettier girl. Eleanor finally moved, her hands reaching up to remove the delicate veil from her carefully pinned hair. She folded it slowly, precisely, focusing on the mechanical action because it was something she could control. Then she reached behind her back to begin the laborious process of unfastening the dozens of tiny buttons that ran down her spine. She'd planned for Charles's mother to help her with this task after the ceremony. The bitter irony wasn't lost on her. She'd managed to undo perhaps half the buttons when she heard the scrape of boots outside the door again. Eleanor turned, expecting Mrs. Patterson returning with more unwanted sympathy, but instead found herself looking at a man she'd seen around town but had never formally met. He was tall, with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that needed cutting. His clothes marked him as a working cowboy, all practical denim and leather, and he wore them with the easy comfort of a man who spent more time in the saddle than out of it. He had the kind of face that was more interesting than handsome, all strong angles and weather lines, with eyes the color of creek water that held something Eleanor couldn't quite name. She thought his name was Nathan something, and that he worked for the Foster Ranch north of town. "Madam, I apologize for intruding," he said, his voice low and careful. "I was at the back of the church, and I stayed after the others left. I thought you might need help with those buttons." Eleanor stared at him, trying to process this unexpected development. "That's hardly proper. Neither is leaving you stuck in that dress," he pointed out reasonably. "And I figure propriety is probably the least of your concerns right now. Mrs. Patterson is outside causing a scene, and every gossip in Pendleton is still lingering on the church steps. You can accept help from a stranger or wait until they all decide to come back in and offer their sympathies." He had a point, and Eleanor found that she had no patience left for the social niceties that had governed her life up until this moment. Those rules hadn't protected her from humiliation. They hadn't made Charles keep his promises. They certainly weren't going to help her get out of this dress. "Fine," she said, turning her back to him, "but quickly, please." His hands were surprisingly deft with the small buttons, and he worked in efficient silence. Eleanor could feel the warmth of his fingers through the fabric when he occasionally brushed against her back, and she found herself grateful that he wasn't trying to fill the quiet with empty condolences or meaningless platitudes. "There," he said after a few minutes, finishing the last button. "I'll step outside while you change. Take your time." "Wait," Eleanor said, turning to face him. Up close, she could see that his eyes weren't just one color, but several, green and brown and gold all mixed together. "Why did you help me? You don't know me." He considered the question seriously, his hat still in his hands. "I know what it's like to be in a situation where you need help and everyone's too busy talking to actually do anything useful. Figured you could use someone who wasn't interested in gossip." "Thank you," Eleanor said, and meant it. "I'm Eleanor Thompson." "Nathan Foster," he said, confirming her vague recollection. "And for what it's worth, Charles Whitmore is the biggest fool in Oregon Territory." Then he was gone, closing the door quietly behind him, and Eleanor was left alone with the most genuine thing anyone had said to her all day. She changed out of the wedding dress and back into her everyday clothes, a simple gray skirt and white blouse that felt like armor after the vulnerability of bridal silk. She folded the wedding dress carefully, refusing to crumple it in anger no matter how much she wanted to. Eleanor had been raised to be practical, to salvage what could be salvaged and make the best of bad situations. The fabric could be reused for something else. The embroidery had taken too many hours to waste. When she finally emerged from the back room, she found the church blessedly empty except for Nathan Foster, who was sitting in the last pew with the patient posture of someone accustomed to waiting. He stood when he saw her, and something in his expression made Eleanor's throat tighten. "I'll walk you home," he said. It wasn't a question. Eleanor wanted to argue, to insist that she was fine, that she didn't need anyone's help or pity or company. But the truth was that she dreaded walking through town alone, facing the stares and whispers, and having someone beside her, even a virtual stranger, would make it marginally more bearable. "All right," she agreed. They walked side by side through Pendleton's dusty streets, and Eleanor kept her chin up and her eyes forward, refusing to acknowledge the people who stopped their conversations to watch them pass. Nathan didn't try to make small talk, didn't offer useless comfort, just matched his stride to hers and provided a solid, steady presence at her side. Eleanor's house was small but tidy, with a neat garden out front that she maintained with stubborn determination despite the Oregon summer heat. She'd painted the shutters blue last spring, and Charles had complained that it was too cheerful. Looking at them now, Eleanor was glad she'd ignored him. She paused at her front gate, unsure of the protocol for thanking a strange man for helping her through the worst day of her life. Nathan solved the problem by tipping his hat and turning to leave, but Eleanor found herself speaking before she'd thought through the words. "Would you like some coffee? It's the least I can offer after your kindness." Nathan turned back, studying her face with those complicated eyes. "Are you sure? You've had a hard day. You don't need to play hostess." "I'm sure," Eleanor said, and realized she was. The thought of being alone in the house she'd expected to be leaving today, surrounded by half-packed boxes and abandoned plans, was unbearable. "Please." Her kitchen was small but efficient, and Eleanor busied herself with the familiar ritual of making coffee, while Nathan sat at the wooden table, his hat on his knee. The normalcy of the action was soothing, and by the time she poured 2 cups and sat down across from him, some of the terrible numbness had begun to recede, replaced by a wave of complicated emotions she wasn't quite ready to examine. "How long were you engaged to Whitmore?" Nathan asked, wrapping his hands around his coffee cup. 2 years. We were supposed to marry last fall, but his father got sick, and we postponed." Eleanor heard the flatness in her own voice. "I suppose I should have seen the signs. He'd been pulling away for months." "That's not your fault," Nathan said firmly. "A man makes promises, he should keep them, and if he can't, he should have the decency to say so before the wedding day." "But he's not wrong, is he?" Eleanor heard herself say, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "Lily Morrison is young and pretty and uncomplicated. I'm 23, which is practically old, and I'm too practical and too plain, and Charles probably realized he didn't want to spend the rest of his life with someone so dull." Nathan set down his coffee cup with enough force that it rattled against the saucer. "Now that's just nonsense, and you don't really believe it." "Don't I?" Eleanor laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I've spent my entire life being sensible and responsible. I know how to keep accounts and preserve food and mend fences, but I don't giggle or flirt or make men feel like heroes. Charles wanted someone who made him feel young and alive, not someone who reminded him of his obligations." "Then Charles is a fool who doesn't know the difference between sugar candy and real sustenance," Nathan said, his voice carrying an edge now. "Youth fades, Miss Thompson. In 5 years, Lily Morrison will be older and probably tired from chasing after babies, and whatever shine attracted Charles will have worn off. But you, You're the kind of woman who doesn't fade. You'll be just as strong and capable and interesting at 40 as you are now, probably more so. A smart man would recognize that and count himself lucky. Eleanor stared at him, something warm and unexpected unfurling in her chest. She'd spent the past few hours feeling like a piece of unwanted furniture discarded for a newer model, but Nathan was looking at her like she was something valuable, something worth keeping. "You don't even know me," she said quietly. "How can you possibly say that? I know you stayed calm and dignified when most women would have been hysterical or vengeful," Nathan said. "I know you thought to salvage your wedding dress instead of destroying it in anger. I know you invited me in for coffee when you could have sent me away and nursed your wounds alone. And I know that any man who'd choose giggling over substance is too shallow to deserve you in the first place." Eleanor felt something crack open inside her chest, something that had been locked down tight since James Whitmore had delivered his terrible news. Her eyes burned, and before she could stop them, tears were spilling down her cheeks, hot and fast and completely beyond her control. She tried to turn away, mortified by this display in front of a near stranger, but Nathan was already moving around the table. He didn't touch her, just stood close enough that she could feel his presence, solid and real and unexpectedly comforting. "It's all right," he said softly. "You're allowed to cry. You don't have to be strong every minute." And somehow, having permission made it easier. Eleanor let herself cry, really cry for the first time since this nightmare had begun. She cried for the future she'd lost, for the humiliation she'd endured, for the loneliness that stretched ahead of her. She cried because she was angry and hurt and scared, and because holding it all in had been exhausting. When the storm finally passed, Eleanor found herself with a handkerchief pressed into her hand, Nathan's, she assumed, and the man himself back in his chair, giving her space to collect herself without the added burden of an audience. "I'm sorry," she said, wiping her face and trying to regain some composure. "Don't be. You're entitled." Nathan paused, then added carefully, "Can I ask you something personal?" Eleanor nodded, too wrung out to be properly cautious. "Did you love him? Charles, I mean." The question caught Eleanor off guard, and she found herself really considering it for the first time. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "I cared for him. I thought we'd be good partners. But did I love him the way the novels describe, like my heart would break without him?" She shook her head slowly. "No, I don't think I did. And maybe that's worse somehow. Maybe if I loved him properly, he wouldn't have left. Or maybe he wasn't capable of inspiring that kind of love," Nathan suggested. "Maybe he was always too focused on himself to really see you." Eleanor looked at him curiously. "You sound like you're speaking from experience." Nathan's mouth quirked in something that wasn't quite a smile. "I was engaged once about 3 years ago. Girl named Sarah from Portland. Beautiful, came from a good family. Everything seemed perfect on paper. But she wanted a gentleman rancher, someone who'd hire people to do the work while he played at being a cowboy. When she realized I actually intended to spend my days working cattle and fixing fences and getting dirty, she decided she'd made a mistake. Married a banker instead." "I'm sorry," Eleanor said, meaning it. "Don't be. Took me a while to realize it, but she did me a favor. I would have been miserable trying to be something I'm not, and she would have been miserable being married to a working cowboy. Sometimes people do you a kindness when they leave, even if it doesn't feel that way at the time." "Do you really believe that?" Eleanor asked. "That Charles did me a favor?" Nathan met her eyes directly. "I believe he showed you who he really is before you were legally bound to him for life. And I believe you'll look back on this someday and feel grateful it happened now instead of 5 years down the road when you had children and a shared property and a lot more to lose." Eleanor wanted to argue, but she couldn't. There was truth in what Nathan said, even if it was truth she wasn't quite ready to accept. Charles had always been charming but unreliable, generous with promises but less so with follow-through. She told herself those were minor flaws. things that would improve with age and responsibility. But character didn't change that easily, and if Charles could abandon her at the altar, what else might he have done given time and opportunity? Thank you, she said quietly, for the perspective and for everything else today. Nathan finished his coffee and stood, settling his hat back on his head. I should get going. Let you have some peace. But Miss Thompson, if you need anything, anything at all, I'm at the Foster Ranch most days. You can leave word at the general store, and I'll get the message. I appreciate that, Eleanor said, walking him to the door. And Nathan, please call me Eleanor. I think after today we're past formality. His smile was warm and genuine. Eleanor, then, you take care of yourself. After he left, Eleanor stood in her quiet kitchen and tried to figure out what she was supposed to do with the rest of the day, the rest of the week, the rest of her life. All her plans had been built around Charles, around their shared future. Now she had to construct something new from the pieces that remained, and she had no idea where to start. The next few days were difficult in ways Eleanor hadn't anticipated. The actual event of being abandoned at the altar had been shocking and painful, but the aftermath was worse. Everyone in Pendleton had an opinion, and few of them had the grace to keep those opinions to themselves. Women who'd been friendly before now looked at Eleanor with pity or barely concealed satisfaction, as if her misfortune confirmed some theory they'd held about her all along. Men who'd been respectful now seemed to see her as available in a way that made her skin crawl, as if being jilted had somehow lowered her standards or made her desperate. Eleanor kept her head high and continued her daily routines with determined normalcy. She worked on her sewing commissions, tended her garden, bought supplies at the general store, while ignoring the whispers that followed her through the aisles. It was exhausting, but she refused to hide or show weakness. She'd done nothing wrong, and she wouldn't act as if she had. On the fourth day after the wedding that wasn't, Eleanor was hanging laundry in her backyard when she heard a horse approaching. She looked up to see Nathan Foster riding up to her fence on a rangy bay gelding, and something in her chest loosened at the sight of him. "Eleanor!" he called, dismounting with the easy grace of someone who spent more time on horseback than on foot. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," she said, setting down her basket of clothespins. "Is something wrong?" "Nothing wrong. I just wanted to check on you, see how you're managing." He pulled something from his saddlebag and held it out to her, a small bundle wrapped in brown paper. "And I brought you something." Eleanor took the package curiously and unwrapped it to find a book, the leather cover worn but well cared for. She opened it to the title page and felt her throat tighten. Pride and Prejudice. I've wanted to read this for years, but the Mercantile never has novels in stock. It belonged to my mother, Nathan said. She passed 3 years ago, and I've been keeping her books, but I thought you might enjoy it. You can return it when you're finished, or keep it if you'd like. Eleanor looked up at him, struck by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. "This is very kind, but are you sure? If it was your mother's?" "I'm sure. She would have liked you, and she always said books were meant to be read, not locked away gathering dust." Eleanor clutched the book to her chest, feeling the unexpected sting of tears again. In the past few days, she'd received pity and gossip and unwanted advice, but this was the first genuine kindness anyone had offered. "Thank you. Would you like to come in? I made apple cake yesterday." Nathan's face brightened. "I wouldn't say no to apple cake." They sat at her kitchen table again, and Eleanor cut generous slices of cake while Nathan complimented her garden and told her about the new foals at the Foster Ranch. The conversation was easy and comfortable, and Eleanor realized with some surprise that she was genuinely enjoying herself, that the knot of tension she'd been carrying since the wedding day had loosened slightly. "Can I ask you something?" Nathan said after a while, his tone turning more serious. "Of course. What are you going to do? Long term, I mean. Are you planning to stay in Pendleton?" Eleanor had been asking herself the same question. "I don't know. My sewing brings in enough to live on barely, but I'd hoped." She trailed off, embarrassed. You'd hoped to have a husband and a family and a different life, Nathan finished gently. That's nothing to be ashamed of. I just feel stuck, Eleanor admitted. I'm too old to start over completely, too young to resign myself to spinsterhood, and this town will never let me forget what happened. Every time anyone looks at me, I'll be the woman Charles Whitmore left at the altar. Nathan was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. What if you didn't have to be that woman? What do you mean? What if people had to think of you differently? What if you weren't the abandoned bride, but something else entirely? Eleanor frowned, not following his logic. I don't see how that's possible. People's memories don't work that way. Nathan took a breath, and Eleanor had the sense that he was about to say something important. It's possible if you give them a different story to tell. Eleanor, I have a proposition for you, and I want you to hear me out before you respond. All right, Eleanor said cautiously. Marry me instead. Eleanor's fork clattered onto her plate. What? Marry me, Nathan repeated, his voice steady. Not right away, we'd court properly for a few months so people don't think we're both crazy. But you need security and a fresh start, and I need a wife and partner. We get along well. We're both practical people, and we could build something good together. Eleanor stared at him, trying to process what he was suggesting. Nathan, that's insane. We barely know each other. We know each other better than a lot of couples do when they marry, Nathan pointed out. I know you're strong and capable and kind. You know I'm honest and reliable and won't run off with a younger woman when times get tough. That's a better foundation than romance alone. But you don't love me, Eleanor said, feeling like the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Not yet, Nathan agreed, but I care about you, and I respect you, and I think love can grow from that if we let it. My parents had an arranged marriage, started off as strangers, and they built the happiest partnership I've ever seen. They chose to love each other every day, and that turned out to be stronger than any romantic notion. Eleanor's mind was racing. It was a crazy idea, impractical and impulsive, and nothing like the careful plans she'd always made for her life. But then again, those careful plans had led her to standing alone in a church while Charles ran off with a girl barely out of childhood. Maybe careful planning wasn't the answer she'd thought it was. Why? She asked. Why would you want to marry me? You could court someone properly, find a woman you actually love. Nathan's expression was earnest. Because I'm 30 years old, and I've been watching other men find wives and build families while I wait for some perfect romantic feeling that never comes. I liked Sarah well enough, but I wasn't heartbroken when she left, just disappointed. I'm starting to think I'm not built for grand passion, Eleanor. I'm built for partnership and commitment and building something that lasts. And when I saw you standing in that church, holding yourself together with pure will while everyone around you fell apart, I thought, there's a woman who understands what really matters. There's a woman worth building a life with. Eleanor's heart was pounding, and she felt dizzy with the sudden possibility opening up before her. This is madness. Maybe, Nathan said. But is it any more mad than marrying Charles would have been? At least with me? You know exactly what you're getting. I'll work hard, I'll be faithful, I'll respect you and your opinions, and I'll do my best to make you happy. I can't promise passionate love, but I can promise partnership and security, and a life where you'll never have to worry about being abandoned or humiliated again. Eleanor stood abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at her small garden without really seeing it. Everything Nathan said made sense, which was perhaps the most frightening part. This wasn't some romantic gesture born of impulse. It was a practical solution to both their problems, offered by a man who seemed to understand her in ways Charles never had. But marriage was supposed to be about love, wasn't it? About passion and romance and the kind of feelings that made people write songs and poetry. What Nathan was proposing was more like a business arrangement, a partnership based on mutual benefit rather than emotion. Except Eleanor had tried planning a marriage based on what she'd thought were the right feelings, and that had ended in disaster. Maybe the poets and novelists had it wrong. Maybe real, lasting love was something you built deliberately, day by day, choice by choice. I need time to think, she said finally, turning back to face him. Nathan stood, his expression understanding. Of course, this is a big decision, and you should think it through carefully. I'm not going anywhere, Eleanor. Take all the time you need. After he left, Eleanor sat down with the book he'd brought her and tried to focus on the words, but her mind kept drifting to his unexpected proposal. It was ridiculous. It was impractical. It was possibly the most sensible thing anyone had suggested in years. Over the next week, Nathan visited every day, never pushing or pressuring, just spending time with her. He helped her repair a broken section of fence. He brought her fresh vegetables from the ranch gardens. He sat at her kitchen table and told her stories about his life, his work, his dreams for the future. And slowly, Eleanor began to see the shape of what life with Nathan Foster might look like. He was steady in a way Charles had never been, reliable and honest, and genuinely interested in her thoughts and opinions. When she talked about her sewing business, he asked intelligent questions and made suggestions about how she might expand it. When she mentioned wanting to plant a larger vegetable garden but worrying about the water supply, he showed up 2 days later with plans for a better irrigation system and offered to help build it. He made her laugh with dry observations about the ranch hands and their antics. He listened when she talked about her parents and the grief that still caught her off guard sometimes. He treated her like a person of value, not a prize to be won or a convenience to be managed, and Eleanor found herself looking forward to his visits with an anticipation that had nothing to do with loneliness and everything to do with genuinely enjoying his company. 2 weeks after Nathan's proposal, Eleanor made her decision. She invited him for dinner, making a special effort with the meal, and when they'd finished eating and were sitting with coffee, she took a deep breath and met his eyes across the table. I've thought about your proposal, she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. And I'd like to accept if the offer still stands. Nathan's face transformed with a smile that made him look younger and unexpectedly handsome. It stands. Eleanor, you won't regret this. I promise I'll do everything I can to make you happy. I have conditions, Eleanor said quickly. I want a real partnership, not a marriage where the husband makes all the decisions and the wife just agrees. I want my opinions to matter, and I want us to be honest with each other, always, even when it's difficult. Done, Nathan said immediately. I wouldn't want it any other way. And I have a condition too. I want us to really try, Eleanor. I don't want this to be just a practical arrangement where we're polite strangers living in the same house. I want us to build something real, to take the time to know each other and care about each other properly. Eleanor felt warmth spread through her chest. I want that too. They courted properly after that, or as properly as two people who were already engaged could court. Nathan took Eleanor on a picnic by the Umatilla River, spreading a blanket on the grassy bank and unpacking a basket of food, while Eleanor tried not to think about how Charles had never once planned anything so thoughtful. They attended a dance in town together, and Eleanor held her head high as she walked in on Nathan's arm, watching the surprise and speculation ripple through the crowd. Let them talk, she thought. Let them say whatever they wanted. She was building something new, something better, and their opinions didn't matter. Nathan was a good dancer, surprisingly light on his feet for such a tall man, and he led her through reels and waltzes with confident ease. When they took a break to catch their breath, Eleanor saw Mrs. Patterson approaching with determination written all over her face. Eleanor, dear, I must say I'm surprised to see you out and about so soon after. Well, you know, the older woman said, her eyes bright with curiosity. And with Mr. Foster, no less. How quickly things change. Eleanor smiled sweetly. Life doesn't stop just because one man proved unworthy, Mrs. Patterson. And I'm grateful to have found someone who knows the value of loyalty and keeping one's promises. Nathan's hand tightened on her waist in silent support, and Mrs. Patterson's expression turned pinched. She made some excuse about needing to check on the refreshments and hurried away, clearly disappointed that Eleanor hadn't provided better gossip. That was well handled, Nathan murmured as he led Eleanor back onto the dance floor. I'm tired of being the object of pity, Eleanor said. I'd much rather be the object of envy. Nathan laughed, a rich sound that made several heads turn. Give them a few months, and you will be. I intend to make sure of it. True to his word, Nathan courted Eleanor with steady determination. He introduced her to the Foster family, his father William and his younger sister Margaret, who both welcomed Eleanor with warmth that seemed genuine rather than polite. Margaret, who was 18 and full of energy, immediately declared that they would be great friends and proceeded to involve Eleanor in all her activities, from helping choose fabric for new dresses to discussing which of the local young men were worth considering. I'm so glad Nathan finally found someone sensible, Margaret confided one afternoon while they were sewing together in Eleanor's kitchen. He was engaged before, to Sarah Crawford, and she was beautiful but so impractical. She wanted Nathan to give up ranching and move to the city, can you imagine? As if Nathan would ever be happy anywhere but on the land. Eleanor smiled, enjoying Margaret's chatter. He told me about Sarah. It sounds like they weren't well suited. Not at all, but you're perfect for him. You're practical and capable, and you don't simper or expect him to pretend to be something he's not. Nathan needs someone real, someone who will be a true partner, and that's you. It was nice to hear, even if Eleanor wasn't entirely sure it was true yet. She and Nathan were still finding their way with each other, learning each other's rhythms and preferences, but the foundation was solid, built on honesty and mutual respect, and Eleanor was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, this could work. 3 months after that terrible wedding day, Nathan asked Eleanor to go riding with him. She wasn't an experienced horsewoman, but he was patient, choosing a gentle mare and keeping to easy trails as they made their way into the hills above Pendleton. The late September air was crisp and clean, the landscape painted in autumn colors, and Eleanor felt something like contentment settling into her bones. Nathan led them to a high point with a view that stretched for miles, all rolling hills and golden grassland broken by dark ribbons of trees along the creeks. He dismounted and helped Eleanor down, his hands steady on her waist, and then pulled a blanket from his saddlebag to spread on the ground. I wanted to show you something, he said, settling beside her on the blanket. See that valley there with the creek running through it? Eleanor nodded, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. That's Foster land, has been for 20 years, and that section there, about 200 acres along the creek, that's going to be ours. My father's giving it to us as a wedding present. Eleanor's breath caught. 200 acres was a substantial gift, enough to build a real homestead, to raise cattle and crops and a family. Nathan, that's incredibly generous. He wants to see us settled and happy, Nathan said, and I've been thinking about what we could build there. A house, obviously, big enough for a family. Good barns and outbuildings. Maybe an expanded garden area for you, since I know you enjoy that. I was thinking we could start building this fall, get the basics done before winter, and be ready to move in come spring. That sounds wonderful, Eleanor said, and meant it. She could picture it already, a house rising in that beautiful valley, a place that would be theirs from the beginning, with no memories of Charles or broken promises to haunt her. Nathan reached out and took her hand, his touch warm and slightly rough from work. Eleanor, I know we agreed to wait a few more months before marrying, to give people time to get used to the idea and to let you be sure, but I'm sure, and I hope you are too. Would you mind if we moved the wedding up? Maybe late October, before the weather turns? Eleanor looked at their joined hands, at Nathan's face with its honest eyes and patient expression, and realized that she was sure, more sure than she'd ever been with Charles, because this was built on truth instead of illusions. Nathan wasn't perfect, but he was real, and he saw her clearly and wanted her anyway. That was worth more than all of Charles's empty promises. Yes, she said, October would be perfect. Nathan's smile was brilliant, and before Eleanor quite knew what was happening, he was leaning in and kissing her. It was gentle and sweet, nothing like Charles's kisses, which had always been more aggressive than affectionate. And when they pulled apart, Eleanor found herself smiling. Was that all right? Nathan asked, looking slightly worried. I should have asked first. It was more than all right, Eleanor assured him, and kissed him again to prove it. They were married on a clear October morning in the same church where Eleanor had waited for Charles 3 months earlier. It should have felt strange or painful, but somehow it didn't. This was different in every way that mattered. The congregation was smaller, just close friends and family, and everyone there was genuinely happy rather than curious or pitying. Eleanor wore a new dress, simple and practical in deep blue rather than white, and carried a bouquet of autumn wildflowers that Margaret had helped her gather. When Eleanor walked down the aisle on William Foster's arm, since she had no father to do the honor, she kept her eyes on Nathan waiting at the altar. He looked different in his Sunday best, more polished but no less himself, and the expression on his face when he saw her made Eleanor's heart skip. There was no doubt there, no hesitation, just solid certainty, and something that might have been the beginning of love. Reverend Morrison performed the ceremony with dignity, carefully avoiding any mention of the last time Eleanor had stood in this church. When Nathan said his vows, his voice was strong and clear, each promise weighted with meaning. When Eleanor repeated her own vows, she meant every word in a way she wasn't sure she would have 3 months ago with Charles. The kiss Nathan gave her after they were pronounced husband and wife was proper and respectful, but Eleanor could feel the promise in it, the potential for more when they were alone. The reception was held at the Foster Ranch, a casual affair with good food and better company. Eleanor found herself relaxed and happy in a way she hadn't expected, laughing at Margaret's jokes and accepting congratulations from neighbors who seemed genuinely pleased for them. Even Mrs. Patterson managed to find something nice to say, though her smile was tight. As evening fell and lanterns were lit around the yard, Nathan found Eleanor and pulled her into a dance, swaying to the fiddle music under the stars. Happy? He asked quietly, his breath warm against her ear. Yes, Eleanor said, and realized it was true. She was happy, genuinely happy, for the first time in months. Maybe even longer than that, if she was being honest. Thank you, Nathan, for everything. Thank me in 50 years, he said with a smile, when we've built something that lasts. They spent their wedding night in the ranch house, in the room that had been Nathan's since childhood, and if there was awkwardness in learning each other's bodies, there was also tenderness and patience. Nathan was careful with Eleanor, attentive to her responses, and while their first joining wasn't the passionate intensity of romantic novels, it was warm and genuine, and left Eleanor feeling cherished in a way she never had before. Afterward, lying in Nathan's arms in the darkness, Eleanor felt something settle inside her. This was right. This man, this choice, this life they were beginning together. It might not have started with grand passion, but it was starting with truth and respect, and the kind of steady affection that had room to grow into something deeper. I'm glad you walked into that church room, Eleanor whispered into the darkness. I'm glad you helped me. Nathan's arms tightened around her. So am I. Best decision I ever made. The next months were a whirlwind of activity. Nathan had already begun building their house before the wedding, and now Eleanor threw herself into making it a home. The structure was simple but solid, with a large main room that served as kitchen and living space, 2 bedrooms, and a loft that could be used for storage or additional sleeping space if they had children. Eleanor sewed curtains for the windows and cushions for the chairs Nathan built. She painted the walls a warm cream color and hung shelves for her books and Nathan's mother's dishes, which he'd brought from the ranch house. They worked side by side, learning each other's strengths and weaknesses, figuring out how to move around each other in the small space without collision. Eleanor discovered that Nathan was methodical and patient, but that he got frustrated when things didn't work the way he expected. Nathan learned that Eleanor was more flexible than he'd realized, willing to try new approaches and adapt plans when necessary. Their first argument came in November over something small and ridiculous. Eleanor wanted to plant an herb garden near the kitchen door, but Nathan worried it would interfere with the water drainage he'd carefully planned. They both dug in stubbornly, voices rising, until Eleanor suddenly started laughing. What? Nathan demanded, still irritated. We're fighting about drainage, Eleanor said, wiping tears of laughter from her eyes. Of all the ridiculous things to have our first married argument about. Nathan stared at her for a moment, and then his own mouth twitched. It's a legitimate concern. It's a patch of herbs, Nathan. I think we can figure out a compromise. And they did, Nathan adjusting his drainage plan slightly, and Eleanor agreeing to keep the garden smaller than she'd originally wanted. It was a small thing, but it taught them both something important about how to navigate disagreements, how to fight fair, and find solutions that worked for both of them. Winter came hard that year, with snow piling up around their new house and temperatures dropping below freezing for weeks at a time. Eleanor learned to bank the fire carefully to keep the house warm through the night, to prepare hearty stews and breads that would stick to a working man's ribs. Nathan learned to appreciate coming home to a warm house and hot food, to a wife who greeted him with a smile even when he was covered in snow and mud from checking on cattle in bad weather. They grew closer through those long winter nights, talking for hours by the fire, sharing stories and dreams and fears. Nathan told Eleanor about his mother's death from a fever that had swept through the area, how he'd felt helpless watching her fade. Eleanor talked about losing her parents, about the wagon accident that had happened so suddenly there hadn't even been time to say goodbye. They shared grief and found comfort in not being alone with it anymore. Physical intimacy grew easier and more satisfying as they learned each other's preferences and lost their initial shyness. Eleanor discovered that Nathan was patient and generous in bed, always making sure she found pleasure before taking his own. Nathan learned that Eleanor responded to gentle touches and whispered words, that she was more passionate than her practical exterior suggested. One night in January, lying tangled together under heavy quilts, Nathan propped himself on one elbow and looked down at Eleanor with an expression that made her breath catch. I love you, he said simply. I don't know exactly when it happened, but somewhere along the way, you became the most important person in my world. I wanted you to know. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, but they were happy tears. I love you too. I think I started falling for you that first day, when you helped me with my buttons and didn't try to fill the silence with empty words. You saw me, really saw me, and you stayed anyway. Nathan kissed her then, deep and passionate, and they made love with a new intensity born of spoken feelings and confirmed commitment. Spring arrived eventually, bringing green grass and new calves and the hard work of running a ranch. Eleanor expanded her herb garden and started raising chickens, selling eggs in town along with her sewing work. Nathan and his father bought more cattle, expanding their herd and their range. Life settled into a rhythm that was exhausting but satisfying, each day bringing new challenges and small victories. Eleanor hadn't seen or heard from Charles since the wedding day. That wasn't, but in April, news filtered back to Pendleton through the gossip networks. Charles and Lily had married in Portland but were already having problems. Lily was pregnant and homesick. Charles was working as a clerk in a shipping office and hating every minute of it, and apparently they fought constantly about money and his drinking and her complaints about their small apartment. Are you all right? Nathan asked when Eleanor heard the news, his hand finding hers across the dinner table. Eleanor considered the question seriously. A year ago, even 6 months ago, hearing about Charles's troubles might have given her some bitter satisfaction or even pain, but now it just made her feel sad for both of them. Two people who'd made impulsive decisions based on attraction rather than compatibility. I'm fine, she said honestly. I hope they figure things out, for the baby's sake, if nothing else. But Nathan, I'm grateful things worked out the way they did. If Charles hadn't left, I never would have found you, and I can't imagine my life without you now. Nathan raised her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. I feel the same way. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, Eleanor Foster. In June, Eleanor began to suspect she might be pregnant. She waited another month to be sure, and then told Nathan one evening, while they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. I'm going to have a baby, she said quietly. Sometime around February, I think. Nathan went very still, and for a moment, Eleanor worried about his reaction. But then he turned to her with tears in his eyes and pulled her into his arms, holding her like she was something infinitely precious. Are you happy? Eleanor asked, suddenly uncertain. Happy doesn't begin to cover it, Nathan said, his voice rough with emotion. Eleanor, you've given me everything. A home, a partnership, love, and now a child. I don't have words for how blessed I feel. The pregnancy was difficult in some ways, with morning sickness that lasted well past the first few months, and exhaustion that made even simple tasks feel overwhelming. But Nathan was endlessly patient and supportive, taking over more of the household work and insisting that Eleanor rest when she needed to. Margaret visited frequently, excited about becoming an aunt, and full of advice gleaned from helping with births among the ranch families. In February of 1884, after a long and exhausting labor that had Nathan pacing the floor while Margaret and the midwife worked, Eleanor delivered a healthy baby boy. They named him Thomas after Eleanor's father, and when Nathan held his son for the first time, the expression of wonder on his face made all the pain worthwhile. He's perfect, Nathan whispered, tracing the baby's tiny features with one gentle finger. Eleanor, he's absolutely perfect. Eleanor, exhausted but exhilarated, watched her husband cradle their son and felt her heart expand with a love so fierce it was almost painful. This was her family, the life she'd built from the ashes of humiliation and abandonment. Charles leaving her at the altar had seemed like the end of the world, but it had actually been the beginning of something far better. Thomas was a healthy, happy baby who grew into a curious and energetic toddler. Nathan was a devoted father, patient with Thomas's questions and eager to teach him about the ranch and the animals. Eleanor balanced motherhood with her work, finding ways to sew and garden with a small child underfoot, grateful for Margaret's help on days when the juggling act became too much. In the summer of 1885, Eleanor found herself pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, and in March of 1886, she delivered a daughter they named Catherine, after Nathan's mother. Thomas was fascinated by his baby sister, constantly wanting to help care for her, and the house was filled with the noise and chaos of young children. Life wasn't always easy. Money was sometimes tight, especially after a hard winter or when cattle prices dropped. There were disagreements and frustrations, days when Eleanor felt overwhelmed by the demands of two small children and a household to run, nights when Nathan came home exhausted from 18-hour days during calving season. But through it all, they had each other, and that foundation held firm. Eleanor's sewing business had grown by word of mouth, and she now took in enough work that she was considering hiring an assistant. Nathan and his father had built the ranch into one of the most successful operations in the area, with a reputation for quality cattle and fair dealing. They weren't wealthy by any means, but they were comfortable, secure, and respected in the community. One evening in the summer of 1886, Eleanor and Nathan sat on their porch after the children were finally asleep, enjoying the rare moment of quiet. Eleanor was working on a delicate embroidery commission, and Nathan was reviewing account books by lamplight, but their feet were touching on the small bench they shared, maintaining that constant physical connection that had become habit. "Do you ever think about that day?" Nathan asked suddenly. "The day Charles left you at the altar?" Eleanor set down her embroidery and considered the question. "Sometimes, but not the way you might think. I don't feel angry or hurt anymore. Mostly I just feel grateful that it happened because it led me here." to this life with you. I think about it too, Nathan admitted. And I have this moment of terror, imagining what would have happened if you'd married Charles anyway, if somehow things had worked out. I would never have had the courage to approach you, and I would have missed out on the best thing in my life. Eleanor reached out and took his hand, lacing their fingers together. But I didn't marry Charles, I married you, and we built this life together. That's what matters. Nathan set aside his account books and pulled Eleanor into his lap, holding her close. Do you remember what I told you that first day? About youth fading, but you not fading? I remember, Eleanor said softly. I was right, Nathan said firmly. You're even more beautiful now than you were that day, Eleanor. You're strong and capable, and the best mother and wife I could have imagined. You haven't faded at all. You've just become more yourself, more vibrant and alive and essential. Eleanor kissed him, putting all her love and gratitude into the gesture. And you've become my whole world, Nathan Foster. You and our children, and this life we've made. I wouldn't trade it for anything. As the years passed, their family continued to grow and evolve. Thomas grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved helping his father with the ranch work. Catherine was bright and imaginative, always making up elaborate stories and games. In 1888, Eleanor delivered another son, James, and in 1890, a second daughter, Rose. The house expanded to accommodate the growing family, with Nathan and his father building an addition that gave each child their own small bedroom. Eleanor's parents had been dead for over a decade now, and Charles Whitmore was nothing but a distant memory, someone she thought of with detached curiosity on the rare occasions his name came up in conversation. She'd heard through the Pendleton gossip mill that he and Lily had divorced after a few miserable years, that Charles had moved to California and Lily had remarried a farmer and seemed content enough. Eleanor felt no satisfaction or pain at the news, just a mild hope that both of them had found whatever they'd been looking for. The ranch prospered, becoming one of the most successful in Eastern Oregon. Nathan's father eventually retired, turning over most of the daily operations to Nathan and Eleanor, who proved to be excellent partners in business as well as marriage. Eleanor's eye for detail and head for numbers complemented Nathan's knowledge of cattle and land management perfectly. They made decisions together, respected each other's expertise, and built something that would last for generations. Their children grew up strong and healthy, learning the value of hard work and the importance of family. Thomas eventually took over much of the ranch operations, bringing new ideas and energy while respecting the foundation his parents had built. Catherine married a school teacher and opened Pendleton's first proper library. James became a veterinarian, using his skills to help ranchers throughout the region. Rose, their youngest, proved to have a talent for business and eventually expanded Eleanor's sewing operation into a successful clothing store. Through it all, Nathan and Eleanor remained each other's constants. They weathered droughts and economic downturns, illnesses and losses, the inevitable challenges that came with raising 4 children and running a substantial ranch. But they faced everything together, their partnership deepening with each passing year. On their 20th anniversary, Nathan took Eleanor back to the spot where he'd proposed, the high point overlooking their valley. The landscape had changed in 2 decades. Their house was now a substantial homestead, surrounded by barns and outbuildings, corrals and gardens. Cattle dotted the hillsides, and smoke rose from the chimney where their oldest daughter Rose was watching the younger children for the evening. I was terrified when I proposed to you, Nathan admitted, his arm around Eleanor's waist as they surveyed their domain. I was so afraid you'd say no, that you'd think I was taking advantage of your vulnerable moment. Eleanor leaned into his warmth, comfortable after 20 years of marriage and 4 children. I was terrified when I said yes. I thought I was being reckless and impulsive, everything I'd never been before. Do you have any regrets? Nathan asked quietly. Eleanor turned to face him fully, taking in the lines that time and weather had carved into his face, the gray beginning to thread through his dark hair, the solid strength of him that had never wavered in all their years together. He was 50 now, She was 43, and they'd built a life that was richer and fuller than anything she dared dream of at 23. Not a single one, she said firmly. You were right, Nathan. Youth fades, beauty fades, but what we built together, that doesn't fade. It just gets stronger and deeper and more valuable with time. You saw that when no one else did, including me. You saw me, really saw me, and you knew what I was worth. Nathan kissed her then. 20 years of love and commitment and partnership in that single gesture. When they pulled apart, both of them had tears in their eyes. Charles Whitmore was the biggest fool in Oregon, Nathan said, echoing his words from that terrible day in the church. But I'll be grateful to him for the rest of my life, because his foolishness gave me you. No, Eleanor corrected gently. His foolishness freed me to find you. There's a difference. As the sun set over their valley, painting the sky in brilliant colors, Eleanor and Nathan stood together and watched the life they'd built spread out before them. Their children were healthy and happy. Their land was productive. Their love had grown from a practical arrangement into something profound and unshakable. The years continued to pass, bringing grandchildren and new challenges, and the bittersweet joys of watching children grow into adults and begin their own families. Nathan's hair went completely gray, and Eleanor's dark hair streaked with silver. They moved a bit slower, tired more easily, but the connection between them remained as strong as ever. In 1902, 20 years after that terrible wedding day that had changed everything, Eleanor and Nathan celebrated their 20th anniversary with all 4 children and 8 grandchildren gathered around their dinner table. The noise was tremendous, the chaos exhausting, but as Eleanor looked around at the faces of her family, she felt nothing but profound gratitude. After dinner, after the children and grandchildren had finally departed, Nathan found Eleanor on the porch where this had all begun, where he'd proposed and they'd made their first promises to each other. "Happy anniversary, my love," he said, settling beside her with a groan that spoke to aging joints. "Happy anniversary," Eleanor replied, taking his hand with the automatic ease of decades of practice. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed softly. The breeze carried the scent of summer grass and wildflowers. The house behind them was quiet and peaceful, full of memories and love. "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" Eleanor said softly. "What's that?" "I think about the woman I was that day in the church, so scared and humiliated and certain her life was over. And I wish I could tell her that everything was going to be all right. Better than all right. I wish I could tell her that getting abandoned at the altar was the best thing that ever happened to her, because it led her to you." Nathan squeezed her hand. "I think about the man I was, sitting in that church, feeling sorry for you, and not realizing I was looking at my future. If I could go back, I'd tell him to be brave, to see the opportunity in front of him and take it." "We were both braves," Eleanor said. "We took a chance on each other when we had every reason not to." "That took courage." "And faith," Nathan added. "Faith that we could build something good together, even if we couldn't see exactly what it would look like." Eleanor leaned her head on Nathan's shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him, leather and soap and hard work and home. "I love you, Nathan Foster. After 20 years and 4 children and more memories than I can count, I love you more than I did the day we married." "I love you too, Eleanor Foster," Nathan said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "You were right all those years ago. Youth fades, but you haven't. You've just become more of everything I love about you. And I'll spend whatever years we have left proving that I was the lucky one in this arrangement." They sat together until the stars filled the sky, 2 people who'd found each other in the aftermath of broken promises and built something that would last for generations. Eleanor never saw Charles Whitmore again, never knew if he'd found happiness or regretted his choices. It didn't matter. That chapter of her life was closed, replaced by something far better, far truer, far more valuable. The abandoned bride had become a beloved wife, a devoted mother, a successful businesswoman, and the cornerstone of a family that would carry her legacy forward long after she was gone. And it had all started with a cowboy who'd seen past youth and beauty to the strength and worth beneath, who'd offered partnership instead of passion and built something that lasted. In the end, that was worth more than any romantic gesture or passionate declaration. It was worth everything. As Eleanor drifted off to sleep that night, safe in Nathan's arms as she had been for 20 years, her last thought was one of profound gratitude. Not to Charles for leaving her, but to herself for having the courage to start over, to take a chance on an unconventional arrangement, to build a life based on truth and respect, and the kind of love that grew stronger with time instead of fading with youth. The Wild West was a hard place, unforgiving of weakness or mistakes. But it also rewarded courage and determination and the willingness to build something from nothing. Eleanor and Nathan had done exactly that, taking broken pieces and making them into something whole and beautiful and lasting. And somewhere in Portland or California or wherever he'd ended up, Charles Whitmore was missing out on the best thing he could have had, while Eleanor lived every day grateful that he'd been fool enough to let her go and Nathan had been wise enough to catch her. Youth faded just as Nathan had predicted. But love, real love built on solid foundations and daily choices and mutual respect, that didn't fade at all. It just grew richer and deeper, like good wine or well-tended land, becoming more valuable with every passing year. Eleanor Foster, who had once been Eleanor Thompson standing alone in a church waiting for a man who would never come, had found something far better than the life she'd planned. She'd found a partner who saw her worth, a love that deepened instead of fading, and a life rich with meaning and purpose and joy. And that, in the end, was the greatest happy ending she could have imagined.